This is Human Coined, a series that unpacks the mechanics of public finance, the complexities of democracy, and the societies they ultimately shape. I'm your host, Geoff DeBro. Join me in a social dialogue that cracks open important issues that are too often ignored here at home and around the world. And Claire O'Donnell and Marija Risteska, welcome to Human Coined. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
I really appreciate you being on to discuss the publication on addressing gender-responsive budget implementation, how civil society is holding governments accountable to gender promises in budget execution. And before I introduce sort of my first question, I just want to give you a sense of why this title captivated my attention as a practitioner as much as it did. A couple of reasons, I think. First of all, in the work that I do on parliamentary oversight and the strengthening of parliamentary oversight around the world, the implementation phase is one of the areas that garners very little parliamentary attention. You know, the most exciting part is most exciting phase is the budget. Ghana, for example, today I noticed they're tabling their annual budget, and there's live broadcasts and all kinds of social media. There's a lot of hype about the promises that are being made. The second area that gets a lot of attention is related to the role of supreme audit institutions in auditing expenses and in conducting performance audits and reporting to Parliament and to the Public Accounts Committee. So the sort of the ex post audit phase. But the implementation phase is generally ignored by Parliament. And I think the Open Budget Survey data demonstrates that. So, I really want to say a shout out to the work that you're doing, first of all, because certainly in the work that I'm doing, I'm noticing that where Parliament is not holding up to its responsibilities, it's really super important for civil society to be pushing as hard as possible. The second area that I'm super excited to talk to you about is on the whole issue of gender budgeting. And I think here, for me, I've written some publications on the role of Parliament in gender responsive budgeting. But the other thing that I've worked on is helping countries, assessing where they're at in terms of overall gender budgeting capability and capacity. And what I see in the work that you're doing is that you're way out in front. That there are going to be cases where governments have not yet developed the tracking methods, but yet I was going to say riling up. I should say firing up. Riling up has a negative connotation, but you're firing up civil society to play that role. So I just wanted to give you a sense of why, from my eyes, how I found this to be absolutely fascinating. Claire, you were, until very recently, a research associate at the International Budget Partnership, and you're now a professional working in, or continue to be a professional working in gender equality and gender responsive budgeting. Why don't you just maybe start by talking about the work that you did and who the IBP is or what they do?
Sure. Thank you so much for your interest in this. Happy to provide some overview. So the International Budget Partnership is the world's leading nonprofit promoting more responsible, effective, and equitable management of public money. So one thing that I find very special about IBP is the partnering. So we partner globally with civil society, community organizers, government champions, and budget analysts who generate data and advocate for reform to build the skills and knowledge of people. The idea is so that everyone can have a voice in the budget decisions that impact their lives. The project that I was working specifically on is under the term budget credibility. So basically, what we were trying to see, as you say, is there's a lot of focus often on allocation and on the formulation of budget. And we were trying to see what is available, what data we can find around execution, really understanding what is the follow through on all these promises that are made. So this paper was actually built on connections that we were able to make with Marija, who I know you'll introduce shortly. And really, I think IBP has a lot to learn on the space of gender responsive budgeting. More of the work that we do isn't focused on that. So thinking about how we can take the lessons that we are learning on budget implementation and execution and our connections with civil society to see what lessons can be learned from organizations that are already working on gender. So this is a very exciting collaboration and looking forward to delve more into it.
And that's a great point. I mean, the IBP and the Open Budget Survey is one of my go-to tools, definitely. And the Data Explorer, I mean, I just love using that to sort of get an assessment of a country's capacity in terms of budget issues. and also a regional comparison. At the same time, you're right. One of the things that's missing are gender indicators. There are no gender indicators in the entire, and I could see that down the road being something that evolves. Marija, you are both the executive director of the Center for Research and Policymaking in North Macedonia, but you're also the regional director of the Gender Budget Watchdog Network. So why don't you tell us about those two organizations and maybe how you became a sort of key strategic partner in the development of this publication?
Thank you for inviting me, and I think that we have to blame the IBP for this partnership because Center for Research and Policymaking is from the very beginning of the partnership one of the organizations that has joined the Open Budget Declaration, and it has been part of the International Budget Partnership. So we have been working on the monitoring of the budgets and developing different debates on advancing the good governance standards in public finance management in Macedonia, but also in the Western Balkan region for a while. We are, as organization, the Center for Research and Policymaking, an organization that has actively developed and implemented methodologies for watchdogging the budget, including from a gender perspective for quite a long time. Since 2007, we've been working on this type of research, analysis, and advocacy that is based on the evidence gathered through this analysis, and which resulted with policy changes. Because we are one of the organizations not just that preach for gender responsive budgeting, but are also using these tools on daily basis and know the effectiveness of these tools for policy change. We have initiated in 2018 to actually form a network of organizations that use gender responsive budgeting tools. Of course, we started from our own region where we work and where we have been given an opportunity at the beginning by UN Women to transfer our knowledge and expertise in gender budget watchdogging to countries like Albania, Moldova, and build capacities of CSOs there. So we mobilized these CSOs that we have built capacities in, but also expanded the opportunity to network to other CSOs from the region. So we now have over 100 CSOs from Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, and of course we include here Republic of Moldova because we have started with Moldova when we worked with UN Women, and we thought that these organizations need to continue be part of our network, and that opens also an opportunity that is related to our strategy, and that is to try to expand this work on watchdogging the budget from a gender perspective, not just to be focused on the Western Balkan region, but also to work in the European neighborhood countries, but also maybe in North Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, but also expand or replicate our experiences in European countries, because the European Union has, some of the countries have experience to implement gender responsive budgeting systematically in their public finance management systems, but civil society is not actively using gender responsive budgeting tools to watchdog their governments on the way how they are spending the money for gender equality.
That's a great point. I'm going to take, now that we've done the introductions, I'll take one step back and go back to this idea of budget credibility analysis. And maybe Claire, you could start by talking about, why is budget credibility analysis, which I understand is essentially an assessment of how governments are spending their allocated budgets. Why is this important?
Totally. So yes, IBP defines budget credibility as the difference between allocated and executed expenditures. I know it's used by other organizations, like FIFA defines it as budget reliability. There's slight variation in the terminology used, but basically, yeah, the idea of this is that if budgets are not implemented as intended, that directly impacts when and how essential services are delivered and can undermine the progress in addressing poverty and inequality. So IBP's research has found that budget credibility is a challenge that deeply impacts low-income countries. So a 2019 multi-country study IBP conducted found that levels of annual underspending in government budgets averaged nearly 10% across 35 countries and 14% in low-income countries. So this is larger than the entire health budget of many countries. So it's a really big impact. We've also further research IBP conducted with civil society partners in 13 countries found that underspending tends to be greater in social sectors than the aggregate overspend or underspending by the government.
Wow,
So
that's fascinating, actually. Yeah.
yeah, so it tends to be when you see where funds are being moved from, it's disproportionately social sectors, and also found that spending on gender showed an average of one of the lowest rates of budget implementation in the 13 investigations. So countries on average underspent their gender-related allocations by 15% in the study we conducted. One example is that in Ghana, Nigeria, and Zambia, between 2018 and 2020, half of the budget allocations for gender ministries and programs were not spent. And so thinking a lot about what does it say when you have certain allocations and have certain promises being made by government, and there's maybe a lot of advocacy around the allocations and at the beginning in the budget formulation, but thinking about what are all the different problems that go wrong for that money to not get where it's supposed to go. And obviously one complicating factor is that there are so many reasons for a lack of budget credibility, right? It can be from any different part or process in the government that results in funds not getting where they're supposed to. So it's been really interesting to use this, what seems like a simple figure of, okay, this is how much was allocated and how much was executed. But we found that digging into those numbers to find what is behind that lack of commitment brings lots of different stories depending on how you approach it. It's been interesting to see that research.
That's fascinating. And let's take that over to the Western Balkans and Moldovan context, Marija. Maybe you could talk about the issue of budget credibility overall, and certainly how what you termed as gender promises fits into that picture.
Our approach is a bit
Marija,
different. I would say that it's very important what this methodology of IBP is showing us because they look at the budget as a whole and assess the implementation and compare the implementation of the gender relevant programs as per the total budget expenditures. But our approach is a bit more specific to the choice of and interest of the CSOs that are part of our network to actually assess different programs that we believe that all programs are not gender neutral. They are gender relevant. So we are looking at the beneficiaries of the programs, who is gaining and who is losing from budget implementation, and whether the implementation of the budget as well as the budget proposal is responding to the different needs of women and men. The analyses are showing that not always this is the case, and by looking at the beneficiaries from the perspective of the beneficiaries and from gender perspective, we can actually improve the design of the measures that are being funded to respond to the better to the different needs of women and men, to create better opportunities for women and men to have equal access and control over the resources that are put in place with the budget, and to provide more effective implementation of the budget. So it will eventually contribute to what Claire was saying, the better budget credibility.
So, Marija, when I think about this exercise, and I'm not suggesting it has to be done this way at all, but my first thought is I see people poring over numbers, budget figures, looking at, okay, how much was planned in the budget in the in-year and in the in-year report or mid-year review, saying, okay, actually only 50% of that amount or 30% of the amount was spent. What I'm hearing you saying is that your approach may be more focused on
People.
on people. Do you want to just go over that a little bit further?
Yeah.
How you
We are
undertake that
focused on
approach?
people, who is winning and who is losing. So, for example, Claire would look at the budget as a whole, and they would say, like, we have this amount of money planned, 2 million, and we have executed only 50% of that budget, and that budget was relevant for gender equality. So our budget credibility is rather low, for example. But what we are looking at is whether this money that was spent, the 50% of 2 million, who it benefited, whether the access to this 1 million that was spent was equally shared between women and men, whether what was spent on this 1 million was actually responding to the different needs of women and men. And this 1 million can be spent on a road in one village, for example. What does that mean? Does it mean that the access to this road would have to be equal for women and men? Yes, and we know that the needs of women are different. So we would expect that some of the money would go not just for the road, but also for the pavement next to the road and the lighting provided on the way of the road, because this would address the different needs of women for public safety and for mobility, because women not always drive, they usually walk, and this is why pavements address their specific needs rather than just building the road. They are usually victims of violence on public spaces more than men, unfortunately. And this is why we need also a lighting on the road so that we address the needs of women specifically. So our approach would be whether these perspectives have been built into the design of the measure, and whether the budget was used to fund these aspects of the design of the measure.
Okay, but that's not... Yes, go ahead.
Oh,
absolutely,
sorry,
Claire, go ahead.
One thing to talk about the two different approaches, and one thing that's been so fruitful, it's really IBP has a more broad global, we work with different partnerships, have these aggregate data and figures, but it's really great to work with organizations like the Gender Budget Watchdog Network to really pull out the stories behind the numbers, right? And connecting what might seem like these opaque numbers and figures with the actual stories of the women it's affecting, and what it looks like on the ground, and what it looks like to advocate for change, and really understanding, as you said, the people that are affected when these governments aren't spent as promised.
That's a really good point, actually, about collecting the stories behind the data. And I guess when we look at the Open Budget Survey, there are specific questions about public participation in the implementation, in scrutiny of the implementation phase of the budget. That's presumably the reason, right? It's not just about whether there was underspending, but how real people have been affected by that underspending, for example. Yeah, that's a really really good point. Maybe we can talk a bit about some of the other stories behind the numbers. As I mentioned to you just prior to us hitting the record button on this podcast interview, I mentioned the story of, that really struck me was the story of femicide in Argentina that's cited in your publication. Maybe you can, talk a bit about the link to budget credibility and gender budgeting. It's a very powerful story.
Totally. Thanks so much. So yeah, I think this story is such a powerful one of how civil society can hold governments accountable to their promises. This story was shared to me by Julieta Iscurdia, who works at our partner organization, Asociación Civil por la Igualdad y Justicia, or Civil Association for Equality and Justice, ASIJ, which is an Argentinian nonprofit dedicated to defending the rights of the most disadvantaged groups in society. And I was really eager to hear this story from her, as ASIJ has been part of a movement in Argentina to apply pressure to the Argentinian government to uphold their gender promises for almost a decade now. So as you stated, it's the paper outlines starting in 2015 with the femicide of a pregnant 14-year-old in Argentina resulted in massive public protests against the femicide of young women. And from this, the Ni Una Menos movement was born. In response to this public outcry, the Argentinian government publicly stated that they would create a national plan to eradicate violence against women. And at this point in 2015, there was no gender tagging. There was no way for civil society to see how funds in the budget were impacting gender. After this happened, however, a set of women organizations who had experience in PFM, including ASIJ, found that when the budget was publicized, or the allocations, there was no funding for this proposed plan that they had said publicly. So this cohort of organizations that ASIJ was a part of went to the press with the findings and used this public outcry as part of the Ni Una Menos movement, which obviously was much broader than budgets, but also was able to use this public outcry to apply pressure to the government so that the Senate did end up approving funds for the national plan. But it didn't end there, as
unfortunately there's a but, right? So far it sounded great.
What ended up happening was they continued to monitor the budget and saw that when it went to the executive, who's in charge of distributing the funds, the executive cut the funding that the Senate had approved. So again, this is a plan that had been promised, that had been allocated funds and then cut. So civil society went into action again. And in the words of Julieta, they were trying to publicize what they called a serious democratic and constitutional transgression. And ASIJ and other organizations filed a lawsuit against the executive, arguing that the cut in funding was unconstitutional. And what Julieta really drove to me was how important this kind of public outcry was, right? So they had journalists that were reporting on it. They were having public demonstrations that were just showing how important this was to the people of Argentina and how upset they were that these promises that were being made by government weren't being upheld in the budget. And so this combination of concrete data on the missing money with the public outcry resulted in the cabinet chief returning the funds and publicly stating that the cut had been a mistake. And so did end up being funding for this. And I would say it really had to do with this push from the public, both having people within the movement of Ni Una Menos that could read the budget lines and understand what was and wasn't being funded. And I think it just shows the power of collective action, right? In this movement, ASIJ was also very clear to say, please in no part give us credit fully, because we were just one of many organizations that were pushing this. And that idea of the power of a collection of civil society organizations and also having it in the public discourse. And now in 2023, Argentina does have a system for tagging the budget with regards to gender. It's called the Presupuesto con Perspectiva de Género, or Budget with a Gender Perspective. They even have a website where you can look up and see all the different gender taggings. And there's still collaboration with civil society to improve the methodology. It's been kind of a changing and improving as it goes along. And Julieta Arasij was very clear to say, it's not over. No, we need to keep pushing, need to keep making sure that this methodology is evolving as we evolve. And so that idea of this, it's really been a constant dialogue between government and civil society. And it is nice. There are a lot of stories that don't have successful endings, but that idea of it really took a long time, and it really took a lot of pushing and a lot of minds and expertise that's coming together. But being able to see that the promises are now better reflected in the budget, I think is something that they can be really proud of.
That's a great story, and very inspiring story. In a moment, Maria, I'm going to ask you about the state of gender responsive budgeting in the Western Balkans, and we can add Moldova into that. But I just want to say, I think it seems to be so far three things that come to mind. One is that the inability of governments to live up to their promises around social issues and gender sensitive policies. In the case of the gender-based violence, it sounds like very much a lack of political will, right? Okay. But there are also many low and middle income countries that have, that promise larger budgets than they know they can deliver. And then, of course, at budget time or at implementation time, they've got to start cutting back. The problem is there's a lack of GRB, gender responsive budgeting systems, in so many countries to assess the needs of women and marginalized population groups. And I think that's a large part of the problem. And that concludes part one of our interview with Claire O'Donnell and Marija Risteska. We will be continuing the conversation in the next episode. Thanks so much for joining us, and take care. Human Coined is an integral part of Nexus PFM Consulting. If you enjoyed this episode, you can also find us on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. If you have any questions about the work we do, you can contact us at info@nexuspfm.com.